The Yukon River Valley in September 1888 had a particular quality of light in the mornings, something between gold and warning, the kind of sky that trappers read the way sailors read water. The spruce forest ran dark and straight along the ridge lines, and the river moved heavy and slow beneath the first cold that had not yet decided to stay. In the clearing that Elias Croft had chosen the previous spring, three sets of log walls were rising simultaneously from the frozen ground, each one inside the last, each one smaller than the one that surrounded it. The whole arrangement looking from a distance like something a man might build if he had too much timber and not enough sense. His neighbors came to look. That was not unusual in a territory where every new structure was a matter of community interest, where the quality of a man's construction told you something about the quality of his judgment, and both of those things could affect whether you survived the winter or became a story people told the following spring. What was unusual was how they looked. They pulled their horses up at the tree line and sat there, and the expressions on their faces were not the expressions of men evaluating construction. They were the expressions of men watching something they could not yet decide was brave or broken. Elias did not acknowledge them. He was fitting a notched log into the corner of the outer shell, a 24-foot square structure that would become the first of three barriers between his family and the killing cold that would arrive in approximately 8 weeks. He worked with the economy of a man who had been building things for 30 years. No wasted motion, no second guessing, the axe finding its mark each time with a sound like a clock keeping perfect time. The middle shell already stood complete inside the building footprint, 20 feet square, its log walls sealed with the first application of moss and clay that Nora had been working since dawn. The inner shell, 16 feet square, had been finished a week earlier. It stood at the center of everything, like the answer to a question the outer walls hadn't finished asking yet. The neighbor who finally rode close enough to speak was a man named Dale Fitch, who ran a trap line along the eastern drainage and had built 3 single-wall cabins in his 11 years in the territory, each one better than the last, each one an honest expression of what he understood about keeping the cold out. He looked at the nested walls, at the 2-foot gaps between each shell, at the strange arrangement of 3 separate roof lines at 3 different heights, and his face settled into something that was not quite concern and not quite mockery, but lived in the uncomfortable territory between them. Nora Croft did not look up from the trough where she was mixing a second batch of clay and animal hair. She had been working since first light, her hands darkened to the wrist, with the mixture her movements precise and unhurried. When Fitch asked whether her husband had taken leave of his senses, her answer came without hesitation and without the courtesy of eye contact. Her grandfather's brother had built a double-wall shelter on the Montana frontier in the winter of 1831 and walked out of a blizzard that killed 2 men who had laughed at him for wasting timber. She said this the way a person states a fact about weather or geography, something so established it requires no argument, only acknowledgement. Then she went back to mixing clay. Fitch rode away without another word. Word traveled, as it always did in that country, faster than horses and with considerably more embellishment. Elias Croft had come to Alaska in 1858 at the age of 23, following his father north along the same routes that had drawn American settlers into the interior since the purchase. His father, Robert Croft, was a carpenter by trade and a student of cold by necessity, a man who had spent his formative years in the company of his own father, Jonas, listening to accounts of the frontier winters that had shaped everything Jonas believed about the relationship between shelter and survival. By the time Elias was old enough to hold a hammer, he understood that there were 2 categories of men in cold climates: those who built for warmth and those who built for strength, and that only the first category reliably made it to spring. Jonas Croft had been a pioneer in the oldest sense of the word, which meant not adventurer, but endurer, a man who had walked into country that had no interest in his continued existence and had found a way to remain anyway. He had settled in Montana Territory in 1829, 2 years before the winter that would define the rest of his life. That winter arrived without warning in late November, a system that pushed temperatures to 55 below zero within 48 hours and stayed there for 19 days. Jonas had been traveling with a group of 8 other men, all of them experienced, all of them equipped according to the standards of the time, which meant single-wall log shelters with the tightest chinking they could manage and enough firewood to last if the cold broke on schedule. The cold did not break on schedule. By the 4th day, 2 men were frostbitten. By the 7th, the single-wall cabin that housed 6 of the group had dropped to 12 degrees inside, despite a fire burning so hot that the stovepipe glowed red for 3 feet above the roof. Jonas and his partner, a man named Reed, had built a separate shelter the first night out of desperation, and available materials doubling the walls with an airspace between because they had run out of proper chinking, and the gap seemed better than nothing. It was not better than nothing. It was better than everything else. Their shelter held 38 degrees on the coldest night, with a fire half the size of the one destroying the other group's wood supply. When 19 days had passed and the temperature finally lifted, Jonas walked out into air that was merely brutal rather than lethal. 7 of the 8 other men survived. One did not. Jonas spent the rest of his life thinking about why. He never framed it in scientific language because scientific language was not available to him and would not have interested him anyway. What he understood was practical and absolute, a single barrier between inside and outside, no matter how solid, allowed the cold to work steadily at the wall until it reached the warm side. A gap of still air between 2 barriers created a situation the cold could not resolve with patience or persistence. The cold touched the outer wall and made it cold. The cold in the gap touched the outer wall on one side and the inner wall on the other. If the air in the gap could not move, it could not carry that temperature differential anywhere. The outer wall was cold. The inner wall was warm. Between them, the motionless air simply held the boundary without transferring it. He built that way for the rest of his life, with at least one air gap between the outside and the living space. He explained it to his son Robert. Robert explained it to his son Elias. And Elias, standing in the Yukon Valley in September 1888, was building it for the 3rd generation, not because he had been told to, but because he had internalized something, that the telling could only approximate the understanding that thickness was a losing battle and stillness was not. Robert had added the insight about 2 gaps rather than 1. He had spent a winter in a double-wall structure when Elias was 11, and by February of that year had noticed that while 1 gap reduced heat loss dramatically, the temperature at the inner wall still fell below freezing on the coldest nights. The mathematics were simple in the way that useful things are often simple. 1 gap gave the heat 3 boundaries to cross on its way out the inner wall, the still air, the outer wall. 2 gaps gave it 5. Each boundary extracted its toll. By the time the warmth from the innermost space had crossed all 5, it arrived at the exterior with almost nothing left to surrender to the outside air. 3 walls, 2 silences. 1 warm family still standing when spring came. Nora Walsh had grown up in a family of builders on the Montana frontier, the daughter of a man who had learned construction the way frontier people learned everything, by doing it wrong first and then doing it correctly for the rest of his life. Her father had built a double-wall granary in 1852 that stayed above freezing through winters that turned the single-wall barn into something that had to be rebuilt each spring. She had grown up understanding that the space between walls was not wasted space. She had carried that understanding with her the way people carry the things they learned before they knew they were learning. When Elias had told her about the 3-shell design in the spring, she had not been the audience for his explanation. She had been the other half of the conversation. Before he finished describing the outer dimensions, she was already calculating the gap widths, the optimal inner footprint, the sealing requirements that would make the still air actually still rather than merely slow. She told him the inner shell needed to be sealed perfectly because any breach would introduce warm, moist air from the living space into the gaps where it would condense on the cold surfaces and eventually compromise everything the system depended on. The middle shell needed to be sealed on both its interior and exterior faces. The outer shell needed to be sealed well enough to block wind penetration, but did not require the same obsessive attention as the inner 2, because the outer gap was designed to be cold. Its job was to create the first thermal boundary, not to hold warmth. She had also identified the moisture problem before Elias raised it, which was the problem that had defeated other attempts at double wall construction in cold climates: condensation in the gaps turning still air into ice, and ice into a conductor rather than an insulator. The solution was ventilation that equalized pressure without creating circulation. Small vents at the base and peak of each gap positioned with a baffle that prevented any direct draft while allowing air pressure to adjust as temperatures changed. Without pressure equalization, temperature swings would create differentials that could crack the seals. With unrestricted ventilation, the still air would become moving air and the insulation would disappear. The baffle vent was the compromise, small enough and oriented precisely enough that air could equalize without ever flowing in a meaningful direction. Elias had watched her work through this the way he watched good craftsmen approach problems with attention and without wasted motion. He had known when he married her that she was more practically intelligent than he was in the way that some people simply understand physical systems in their bones rather than their heads. He was a better carpenter. She was a better engineer. The combination had served them well for 26 years. The construction proceeded from inside out, which was the only logical sequence. The inner shell went up first because it mattered most and because the other shells would be built around it. 16 feet square spruce logs, 8 inches in diameter, notched at the corners in the style that locked without nails, and had the additional advantage of being reproducible by any competent carpenter in the field. Elias fitted each log himself. Nora chinked it herself, pressing moss into every gap with her fingers, layering clay mixed with the hair from winter pelts over the moss, pressing a final layer of moss into the clay before it dried. The result was a wall that held no air passage. None. She tested every section by holding a candle flame at the interior surface and watching for any movement of the fire toward the wall. If the flame bent, she went back to work. The middle shell rose next 20 feet square, built 2 feet outside the inner cabin on all sides. This shell required different treatment from the inner one. The exterior surface facing the outer gap was sealed against air exchange with that space. The interior surface facing the inner gap was sealed against air exchange with that space. The middle shell was a double barrier sealed on both faces, preventing air movement in either direction. Elias left the 2-foot gap between inner and middle shells completely empty. No storage, no shelving, nothing that could create air pathways or thermal bridges between the surfaces. Small baffle vents at the base and peak of the gap allowed pressure equalization while preventing circulation. The outer shell was the largest and, in some ways, the simplest, 24 feet square, built 2 feet outside the middle shell. This was the structure that would face the full force of whatever the winter chose to deliver. It did not need to hold warmth. It needed to block direct wind contact with the middle shell and create the first thermal boundary. Elias sealed it conscientiously, but without the intensity he brought to the inner 2 shells. Some air infiltration into the outer gap was acceptable. The outer gap was cold by design. Its job was to moderate the temperature that the middle shell faced, not to provide living conditions. 3 separate roof lines, each independent, each carrying only its own snow load, each contributing a thermal layer overhead that matched what the walls provided below. The inner roof was the heaviest construction, thick poles and packed sod because it was the most important. The middle roof sat 2 feet higher, lighter but solid. The outer roof peaked 2 feet above that, shedding weather while creating the final air gap overhead. From a distance, the structure looked like an oversized cabin with walls of impossible thickness. Up close, if you look at carefully, you could see the 3 separate roof lines, the unusual depth of the walls, the gaps visible at the foundation where the shells sat on separate log sills. Thomas Croft arrived from Portland on the 4th of October with a leather case containing drafting tools, a set of engineering textbooks, and the particular confidence of a man who had spent 3 years learning the formal language for things he had previously only observed. He was 27 years old and had his mother's eyes and his father's hands, and neither of their patience for the way the other one thought. He had left for Portland 2 years after his mother died, which was long enough after the death that no one had to say explicitly that he was leaving because of it, and short enough that everyone understood anyway. He stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at what his father had built, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man confronting something that does not fit in any of the categories he has prepared for it. He knew nested shell construction in theory. He had read about the principle in a German engineering paper that had circulated through his program, a theoretical treatment of still air insulation that his professors had discussed with the respectful dismissal they reserved for ideas that were correct but impractical. What he had not expected was to find it standing in a clearing in Alaska, built by his father, with his mother sealing the final sections of the middle shell's exterior face while the temperature dropped toward 0. His father did not come down from the outer shell framework to greet him. He kept fitting logs. The conversation that followed was not technically speaking an argument. It had the architecture of a conversation that wished it were an argument, but had not yet located the specific point of conflict. Thomas asked about the gap width and whether it had been calculated to the optimal thermal resistance value. Elias said 2 feet tested by the experience of 3 generations. Thomas asked about the vapor barrier between the inner shell and the first gap, and whether condensation modeling had been done to verify that the baffle vent design would maintain dry air in the gap under sustained below-zero conditions. Nora, without looking up from her work, observed that the candle test had not showed a single breach in the inner shell's ceiling, and that dry air in the gap was a function of seal construction, not modeling. Thomas looked at the tightly sealed inner cabin walls, at the precise application of moss and clay that his mother had been applying for 6 weeks, and said nothing for a moment. Then the thermal bridging at the log corners needs to be addressed. The notching creates a continuous wood path that bypasses the air gap. Elias set down his axe and looked at his son for the first time since Thomas had walked into the clearing. His voice carried the particular flatness of a man choosing his words because the words he would prefer are not useful. The corner notching has been in the design since your grandfather's time. Show me what you mean. Thomas opened his leather case and produced a pencil and a piece of paper. He sketched the corner connection quickly and efficiently, indicating the thermal pathway through the interlock logs. It was not wrong. The corner was a weak point, as corners in log construction always were, and the nested design did not fully solve the problem at those specific junction points. What Thomas did not yet know, and what his father had known for 30 years, was that the thermal bridging at the corners was outweighed by the overall system performance by a factor that made the imperfection negligible at the temperatures the Yukon routinely produced. But explaining that required explaining everything and explaining everything to someone who had arrived 3 minutes ago with a leather case full of theoretical confidence was not the conversation Elias was prepared to have before the outer shell was finished. He picked up his axe. Help your mother with the chinking on the middle shell's east face. That was how it began between them, which meant it began as it always had, with a task assigned in place of an answer given. Arthur Morse arrived on the 28th of September, which was a Saturday, though the day of the week meant nothing in particular to anyone in that territory. He was a large man with the kind of build that suggested he had once been physically powerful and had gradually converted that power into something more sedentary, a man who ran his trading post with the same certainty he had once applied to physical labor. He had been in the Yukon drainage for 15 years and had built the most substantial trading post structure in the region, 12-inch log walls, that he had spent 3 seasons perfecting, 2 iron stoves that could run simultaneously a wood supply that he calculated with the precision of a man who understood that the margin between enough and not enough in that climate was not a margin at all. He rode up to the Croft clearing in the late morning with the casual authority of someone who had decided before arrival how the conversation would go. The middle shell was complete and visible inside the outer framework. The outer shell's walls were 3/4 raised. The 3-level roof structure was already apparent to anyone with eyes. Morse looked at all of it for a long time from horseback before he spoke. His voice was not unkind. That was the thing that Elias would remember about it later, when the winter had made its judgments and the memory of that conversation acquired a different character. Morse was not a cruel man. He was a confident one, which in cold climates was sometimes indistinguishable from a dangerous one. He asked in the tone of a man confirming something he had already been told, whether it was true that the Russian fellows over in Sitka built something like this with their storage structures, and whether Elias had gotten the idea from some sailor or trapper who had come through with stories about old country building methods. Elias fit a log into the outer shell's north wall before he answered. The notching caught and he seated it with 2 blows of the mallet. Then, the idea came from my grandfather, who got it from a blizzard in Montana in 1831 that killed 1 man out of 9. The one who died was in the thick wall shelter. My grandfather was in the double wall shelter he built the night before because he ran out of chinking material. Morse considered this. One data point. One that he thought about for the rest of his life, and passed to my father. And my father passed to me. The conversation that followed was the kind that happens between men who respect each other enough to argue honestly, which meant it had none of the politeness that would have made it easier and all of the directness that made it worthwhile. Morse made his case clearly and without condescension. Thick walls worked because mass held temperature and resisted cold penetration, and the men who survived Yukon winters survived them because they had built heavy and stocked deep and had the fires to keep up with whatever the cold demanded. The idea that empty space was better than solid logs struck him as the kind of thing that sounded elegant in theory and failed in practice because theory didn't account for frost building in the gaps, for moisture migration from the living space, for the structural vulnerabilities of 3 thin shells versus 1 heavy one. Elias listened to all of it. Then he said, "Cold moves through solid walls. Cold stops at still air. Your thick walls slow the cold down. My still air stops it. Those are different outcomes." He paused, adjusting the next log into position. The gaps connect only to outside air through small baffled vents at base and peak. Moisture from inside stays inside because the inner shell has no breaches. The gaps stay dry because no warm air ever reaches them. And 3 shells means 3 failures required before the living space is compromised. Your single wall means 1. Morse shook his head slowly with the expression of a man who has heard a reasonable argument and has decided that reasonableness is not sufficient grounds for changing his position. His trading post had stood through 14 winters. His wood supply was calculated and ready. He had not survived 15 years in the Yukon by second-guessing methods that had worked. Before he turned his horse south, he rode past the tree line where the main trail curved back toward the river. At the edge of the clearing, visible through the spruce, was the ball structure that a young man named Calvin Marsh had been building through September, a single-wall cabin of green spruce logs cut from the surrounding forest, the chinking applied in long horizontal runs that would tighten if the wood dried evenly and crack if it didn't. Morse looked at it for a moment. Calvin was 29 years old and had come north from Oregon with enough energy and insufficient experience in the kind of physical confidence that made men underestimate cold the way they underestimate water, because it looks passive until it isn't. Morse looked at Calvin's cabin for 5 seconds, maybe 7. Then he turned his horse south and rode toward the trading post without a word. Thomas had been working on the east face of the middle shell when Morse arrived and had listened to the entire exchange without participating in it. He had his mother's silence when observing something he had not yet fully assessed the quality of attention that withheld judgment, not from uncertainty, but from the discipline of watching until the picture was complete. He had also, over the preceding 3 weeks, begun to understand something about what his father had built that his initial reading of it had missed. The technical objection he had raised on his first day about thermal bridging at the corners was valid but incomplete. He had spent 2 evenings working through the full thermal resistance calculation for the nested system, using the actual gap dimensions and the actual conductivity values for seasoned spruce at the temperatures the Yukon produced in January. What he found was that the 2-foot air gaps, when truly still, each contributed a thermal resistance value equivalent to approximately 20 inches of solid log wall. 2 gaps. The total insulation value of the gap system alone exceeded what you would need to wall the living space in nearly 40 inches of solid wood. The 3 log shells added their own resistance on top of that. The corner bridging was real, but it operated on a fraction of the total wall area. The system was, in the language his textbooks used, over-engineered against its primary threat. He had not told his father this. He was not yet sure how to give his father information, or whether his father wanted it from him, or whether the acknowledgement that the design worked was separable from the acknowledgement that it had worked before Thomas had arrived to verify it. What he did instead was continue filling his notebook with measurements and calculations, recording the outer shell dimensions, the gap widths confirmed with a measuring string, the seal quality of the inner cabin assessed by the same candle test his mother used. He had begun logging ambient temperatures inside and outside the building each morning, a practice that would become important in ways he couldn't yet anticipate. His mother had noticed and said nothing, which was the specific quality of Norcroft's approval. She registered things and did not comment until comment became necessary. The argument between Thomas and his father arrived not dramatically, but the way cold arrives gradually and then completely. It happened on an afternoon in mid-October, when Thomas had finished calculating the R value of the nested system and showed the results to his father not as a gift, but as a technical observation that required a response. Elias looked at the calculations for a long time. He recognized the numbers in the same way a craftsman recognizes the formal name for a technique he has always used, with a kind of detached interest, the knowledge that the name and the thing are different categories of knowing. Thomas, watching his father's face, The math confirms the design. The gap system is providing more insulation than any thickness of solid log construction could achieve at practical dimensions. Elias set the notebook down. Your grandfather knew that. He didn't have the math for it. He had the results. One man died and he lived. That was sufficient math for the question he was answering. Thomas's voice tightened in the way that voices tighten when the argument is not about the thing being argued. The question I'm answering is whether this works at 60 below. The results from one winter in Montana in 1831 with different materials and different gap dimensions aren't a controlled study. They're an anecdote. Nora from across the room did not raise her voice. She did not need to. 7 people died and 2 lived, Thomas. Which side of that do you want your controlled study on? The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything both men were not saying, which was considerable. Thomas had come back to Alaska because his father had written to him in the spring, the first letter in 2 years, 3 sentences about the construction project, and 1 sentence at the end that said only that it would be good to have another set of hands. Thomas had interpreted this as an invitation. He was not wrong, but he was also not entirely right, and the gap between those two things was where most of the difficulty lived. Elias later that evening opened the worn notebook that had belonged to his grandfather Jonas. The handwriting was his father Robert's, which meant Robert had transcribed Jonas's words at some point, which meant the original knowledge had passed through at least 3 sets of hands before reaching this page. The entry from the winter of 1831 described the shelter Jonas had built with reed in functional terms, materials, dimensions, approximate gap width, the location of the vents they had improvised from gaps in the outer wall, deliberately left and then covered with pieces of bark that allowed pressure equalization without wind penetration. There was a temperature observation. The fire inside was half the size of the fire in the main cabin, and the temperature inside was warmer. That was the entire scientific record. Thomas was right that it wasn't a controlled study. He was also right about the corner bridging. He was right about several things, actually, and his father knew it, and neither of them knew how to use that fact without losing something else in the transaction. The outer shell was completed on the 18th of October, ahead of the freeze that would end building season. All 3 roof sections were in place and sealed by the 22nd. Elias spent 3 additional days confirming the baffle vent positions and testing each gap for air movement with a strip of thin cloth held at the vent openings. The cloth showed the small equalization movement. He expected a brief flutter as pressure adjusted, then stillness. No sustained flow. The air in the gaps was as designed dead. Thomas documented every step. His notebook now contained a complete technical record of the construction, shell dimensions, gap widths, vent placement, sealing materials, and application methods estimated R values for each component of the system. He had also begun sketching modifications that might improve corner performance in a future iteration. Careful drawings with dimensions and material specifications that his grandfather could never have produced because his grandfather had not had the education for it. Thomas was not sure whether this was an advantage or simply a different kind of knowledge from the kind that had kept 2 men alive in 1831. On the 2nd of November, Elias Croft lit the first fire in the iron stove inside the innermost cabin. It was a modest fire, 6 pieces of split spruce, nothing like the roaring effort that the single-wall cabins in the territory required simply to stay ahead of the cold. The temperature outside was 8 degrees below zero, which was not yet the serious cold, just the prelude. By midnight, it had dropped to 15 below. Elias checked the thermometer he had mounted on the inner wall at 10 in the evening, 49 degrees. He checked it again at 4 in the morning when the fire had been down to coals for 2 hours, 51 degrees. The gaps were already working. The still air between the middle and inner shells, already at 22 degrees above zero by his measurement in the first gap check, was doing what still air had been doing since Jonas Croft had discovered it in a Montana blizzard 57 years earlier. It was holding the boundary, not slowing the cold, stopping it. Nora, awake for the 4 in the morning check because she was always awake for the 4 in the morning check, looked at the thermometer and then at her husband, and then wrote the number in her notebook with the same precision she had used for every number before it. Outside 15 below, inside 51 above, 66 degrees of difference, and the stove had been at coals for 2 hours. Thomas, who had been pretending to sleep, watched his mother record the number and watched his father stand at the thermometer for an extra moment longer than necessary, not verifying the reading, but simply staying with it the way a man stays with something he has carried a long distance and can finally set down. The gap between the design and the proof had closed. The proof was 51 degrees at 4 in the morning, with a dying fire, and outside the killing cold was pressing against the outer shell and losing. The next morning, the temperature outside had dropped to 20 below. The temperature inside the inner cabin with a fresh fire burning for an hour was 53 degrees. Thomas recorded both numbers without comment. His notebook now contained 6 days of temperature data, and the pattern in the numbers was not subtle. It was not the kind of pattern that required statistical analysis to interpret. It was the kind of pattern that answered the question it had been asked completely and without equivocation. He would not tell his father for another 3 weeks that he had confirmed the design using thermal resistance calculations from his Portland textbooks and found that the numbers matched. He would not say that he had been wrong. He would do what his family did instead, which was keep measuring and recording until the record itself said everything that needed to be said. Outside, the spruce trees stood dark against the first serious cold, their needles holding the small amounts of snow that had come early and stayed. Somewhere to the south, 40 miles down the river, Arthur Morse was calculating his wood supply and feeling the first ghost of a draft through the wall of his trading post that he had not felt in October. And somewhere along the eastern trap line, in a single-wall cabin of green spruce logs with chinking that had begun to show its first small cracks as the wood dried unevenly in the freeze, Calvin Marsh was adding another piece of wood to his stove and deciding that he had enough to last until February, which was the calculation of a man who did not yet understand that February was not the problem. The problem was January. The problem was what January was going to become. The inner cabin held 53 degrees against 20 below, and the fire was modest, and the walls showed no frost, and somewhere in the depth of the insulated silence between 3 layers of log and 2 layers of still air, the gap between what Elias Croft's grandfather had learned in 1831 and what a Portland-trained engineer would eventually write into technical literature was narrowing toward nothing. Not because one kind of knowledge was defeating the other, because they had always been describing the same thing. Thickness was not strength. The Americans who built their walls heavy and their stoves hot were fighting a battle they would always be losing because cold did not require a victory. It required only patience and a continuous path. Elias Croft had removed the path. He had done it the way Jonas had done it, the way Robert had done it after Jonas, with gaps of air that could not circulate and therefore could not carry and therefore could not deliver. 2 feet of nothing, twice. The fire needed feeding only 4 times a day, 6 pieces each time, a quarter quart of wood every 2 weeks. Outside, men were already starting to calculate whether their supply would last. Inside the innermost cabin, the question had already been answered. November arrived in the Yukon the way it always did, not as a change in the calendar, but as a change in the quality of everything. The light went thin and slanted, and then disappeared for longer each day. The river, which had been moving with purpose through October, slowed to something that looked like deliberation, before it stopped deliberating and simply froze. The temperature by the first week of the month had settled into the 20s below zero, and was conducting itself as though this were a permanent arrangement rather than a prelude, the cold staking its claim methodically and without drama, the way a patient creditor arrives not with threats, but with paperwork. At Arthur Morse's trading post, which sat 40 miles south of the Croft homestead at a river bend that made it the natural stopping point for trappers working the eastern and western drainages, the conversation had moved past curiosity and into something with more weight in it. Men who came in for supplies or to sell early-season pelts asked about the Croft construction the way people ask about things they have dismissed but cannot stop thinking about. Morse had not yet told anyone what he had seen. He answered questions about it with the careful neutrality of a man who has invested significantly in a position he is no longer fully confident in and has not yet decided what to do with the doubt. Roy Greer had no such hesitation. He was 51 years old and had been operating a competing supply post 12 miles upriver for 6 years, and he had the specific kind of commercial intelligence that tracked every development in a territory not for its own interest, but for its implications for everyone else's business. He had heard about the Croft construction in October and had ridden out to see it himself on a cold afternoon when the outer shell was still going up. He had looked at it for 10 minutes and ridden back and begun the process of systematic discrediting That was his preferred response to things he could not immediately use to his advantage. At the trading post where he appeared every 10 days or so, with pelts and orders and the easy confidence of a man who understood the social economy of isolated places, Greer offered his assessment with the generosity of someone sharing a practical concern. The timber was green. Everyone knew Croft had cut most of it from the surrounding forest in September rather than using properly seasoned logs. Green spruce in a structure of that complexity with 3 independent wall systems that had to stay sealed under differential thermal contraction was going to develop cracks by January. Not maybe. The wood would move, and the chinking would fail, and the whole nested theory would have nowhere to hide when the gaps filled with cold air that was circulating through the breaches rather than sitting still. 3 thin walls with the cracks were worse than 1 thick wall without them, because 3 sources of failure were 3 times the opportunity for the cold to find a path. There were men at the trading post who had seen the structure and who knew that the logs Elias had used were seasoned tum he had been storing since the previous spring, not green-cut material. None of them corrected Greer. It was not that they were afraid of him. It was more that the story he was telling was more satisfying than the truth because it fit within the boundaries of what people already understood about construction, and the truth was something stranger and less comfortable. Calvin Marsh was at the trading post the afternoon Greer made this argument in its most complete form, and he listened with the attentiveness of someone for whom the information was directly relevant. His own cabin used green timber because he had not planned far enough ahead to do otherwise, and the distinction between his situation and the one Greer was describing about Croft did not register as clearly as it should have. What registered was the general message that nested construction was complicated in ways that invited failure, and that simplicity and sufficient fuel were the reliable path through a Yukon winter. He bought 2 additional cords of wood that afternoon, which brought his total supply to what he calculated was comfortably more than he would need. He was 29 years old and had spent 2 previous winters in Oregon, which was cold in the way that polite disagreements are cold technically true, but fundamentally different in kind from what it was describing. Pete Harlan came north from his trap line on the 15th of November, which put the outside temperature at 22 below when he arrived at the Croft clearing in the early afternoon. He was 44 years old and had been trapping the Yukon drainage for 12 years, arriving from Maine with a practical education in cold weather construction that was deeper than most and shallower than he was about to discover. He had built a double-wall cabin in Vermont years before coming north, a structure he had been genuinely proud of, and that had performed well for 2 winters before the 3rd winter revealed that moisture from the interior had been migrating into the air gap through a series of microfailures in the inner wall seal, condensing on the cold outer wall surface, and gradually turning the still air insulation into a layer of ice that conducted rather than resisted. He had spent an entire summer rebuilding the seal, and the experience had left him with a highly calibrated understanding of what double-wall construction required to work and what it looked like when it was failing. He had been thinking about the Croft structure since Morse had first mentioned it in October, running through the design in his head the way a mechanic runs through an unfamiliar engine, finding the sequence of components, identifying the failure points, testing the logic of each connection against what he knew about how cold and moisture actually behaved in real structures under sustained stress. Elias met him at the outer door and took him through the 3 shells in sequence. Pete stopped in the first gap for longer than Elias expected. He stood with his back against the outer shell's interior surface and looked across the 2 feet of dark, still air at the middle shell's sealed exterior. And the thing he was registering was not the temperature, which was cold, but motionless, a cold that had none of the cutting quality that outside cold carried, because it carried no wind and no circulation. He was registering the absence of something. There was no frost on the middle shell's exterior surface. In any double-wall structure he had ever worked on or examined, the cold side of the inner shell showed frost within the first serious cold snap, because even a mostly sealed wall allowed enough moisture vapor transfer to find the cold surface and freeze on contact. The middle shell's exterior face was clean, dry wood in the lamplight Pete carried. Through the middle door into the second gap, where the air registered noticeably warmer, and then through the inner door into the living space where Nora was at the table with a small lamp and a piece of mending, and the thermometer on the wall read 53 degrees. Pete stood in the middle of the room and did not speak for almost a full minute, which was a significant silence from a man who was not given to long pauses. His voice when he found it was quieter than his usual register. He had built one gap because one gap was what he had known to build. It had not occurred to him that two gaps would compound the protection in the way that five boundaries compounded it rather than simply doubling three. He understood it now as a mechanical fact the way you understand a lever the moment you actually use one rather than just having it described to you. Each additional boundary extracted its portion of the heat trying to escape. Each layer of still air held its portion of the temperature differential that was trying to migrate outward. By the time warmth from the inner shell reached the exterior, it had surrendered its energy in stages to surfaces that absorbed it without passing it further. He asked about moisture control, and Elias explained the baffle vent system, the small vents at base and peak of each gap, positioned so that the opening faced perpendicular to any prevailing pressure differential, allowing equalization without flow. The inner shell had no vents at all because the inner shell was the moisture boundary. Everything from the living space, the cooking steam, the breath, the body heat, all of it stayed inside the inner shell where the stove managed it. The gaps never saw warm, moist air. The gaps saw only the cold, dry air of the Yukon winter, which contained almost no moisture to deposit on any surface. Pete was quiet for a moment longer. Then, I lost my gap to moisture because I thought a good seal was good enough. A good seal slows moisture migration. A perfect seal stops it. He looked at the inner wall surface, smooth and unbreached, the chinked surface Nora had tested with candle flame at every section. You didn't build a good seal, you built a perfect one. Nora, without looking up from her mending, there's no such thing as a perfect seal that you find later. There's only a perfect seal you build while you still can. Pete left that evening with the posture of a man carrying something new, not a burden but an addition to the framework he had been using to understand the world, a piece that fit but changed the shape of what was already there. His double-wall cabin 12 miles east was performing adequately at 22 below. He would think about that word adequately for the rest of November, with a new and less comfortable understanding of what it meant at temperatures he had not yet seen this season. Thomas had been present for the entire visit, sitting in the corner with his notebook recording the temperatures Pete had read in each gap layer and the outside temperature at the time of the observation. He had not participated in the conversation. He was learning something about the way his father conveyed technical knowledge that was different from anything he had learned in Portland. It moved through demonstration rather than explanation, through the physical experience of standing in a gap at 22 below and feeling the absence of wind rather than through any description of why the wind was absent. The experience preceded the understanding, and the understanding that followed was of a different character from the understanding that came from reading about the same principle in a German engineering paper. He was not sure yet what to do with this observation. He recorded it in his notebook anyway in the margin of the page, with Pete's temperature readings in the smaller handwriting he used for things he was still working out. James Whitmore arrived from Juneau at the end of November with a leather instrument case and the institutional skepticism of a man who had been sent to verify something by people who expected him to find it wanting. He was 35 years old and worked for a territorial survey office that had been receiving reports about the Croft construction from 3 separate sources, all of them contradictory in their conclusions, which was the specific kind of situation that bureaucratic organizations respond to by sending someone official to look. He had good instruments and a systematic mind and the particular quality of professional honesty that made him willing to follow his measurements wherever they led, even when they led somewhere inconvenient. He spent the better part of 2 days at the Croft homestead, measuring and recording with a thoroughness that Elias watched with the equanimity of a man who has no reason to discourage scrutiny. Whitmore measured every shell dimension, every gap width at multiple points to confirm consistency, every vent placement and size. He took temperature readings in each gap at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening over 2 consecutive days, and recorded outside temperature simultaneously. He examined the inner shell ceiling with a lamp and a strip of tissue paper held at the surface, which was a more sensitive test than the candle method because tissue paper responded to air movement that was too slight to deflect a flame. The tissue paper did not move anywhere along the inner shell interior. Whitmore sat at the table in the inner cabin on the evening of his second day and worked through his calculations while Nora made coffee and Thomas watched from across the room with his own notebook open. The arithmetic took 20 minutes. When it was done, Whitmore set his pencil down and looked at the results for a moment with the expression of someone confirming that they have read a number correctly before they say it out loud. Each 2-foot air gap under the conditions of the Croft construction, fully sealed shells baffled pressure vents. No moisture infiltration was providing a thermal resistance value of approximately R20. Two gaps delivered R40 from still air alone before the contribution of the log walls was counted. The 3 log shells at the diameter Elias had used and the species-specific conductivity of Alaskan spruce at below zero temperatures added roughly another R12 to the total system resistance. The complete assembly from inner cabin surface to outer shell exterior was performing at somewhere between R50 and R55, depending on conditions. The thickest practical single-wall log construction, unachievable with available materials in that territory, the kind of construction Arthur Morse had spent 3 seasons perfecting at his trading post, topped out at approximately R8 to R10. Whitmore's voice was neutral in the way that professional voices go neutral when the finding is too significant to deliver with ordinary inflection. You have built the thermal equivalent of a 10-foot thick log wall using 3 thin shells and dead air. The mathematics are not ambiguous. A pause and then something that was less an observation than a concession. The principle was known in theory. I've read the literature, but no one I'm aware of had built it at this scale and in conditions this extreme. Thomas looked up from his notebook. He had arrived at a very similar number 3 weeks earlier through a different calculation path and had been sitting with it since, and the sensation of hearing someone else confirm it was strange in a way he hadn't anticipated, somewhere between vindication and grief, because the number also meant that he had spent 3 weeks being right about his father's design and had not said so. Elias said nothing. He looked at Whitmore's calculation sheet with the attention of a man reading a translation of something he already knows in the original language. December came in without ceremony, and the temperature settled below zero and stayed there, varying between 10 and 30 below on any given night, which was serious cold by most standards and was understood by everyone in the Yukon drainage to be the warm part of what was coming. At Morse's trading post, the first signs of structural heat loss that would become critical by January were already apparent to anyone paying attention, which Morse was, because he had built his post with the care of a man who paid attention to everything, and he knew the difference between the building performing as expected and the building beginning to work harder than it should have to. The frost line on the interior walls had moved. In October, it had appeared only in the corners where chinking was thinnest, and the log intersection created thermal pathways that the mass of the walls couldn't fully compensate for. By the first week of December, it was visible along the lower sections of the north and west walls, a white crystalline creep that appeared in the mornings and retreated slightly toward midday when the stoves were running hardest. His 2 iron stoves were burning at 3/4 capacity. His wood calculation, which had been comfortable in September, was beginning to look like arithmetic done by a man who had assumed a different problem than the one he was actually facing. He did not ride north. He was not ready to ride north. There was a specific kind of pride in a man who has built something with his own hands and defended it in public that makes the first evidence of its limitations feel like a personal verdict rather than a practical problem. And Morse had enough self-awareness to know he was in that phase and not yet through it. He sent a hired man north instead, telling him to stop at the Croft homestead on the pretext of checking on the family's supply needs and to observe whatever was observable and report back. The man returned 2 days later and reported 53 degrees inside the inner cabin, measured on the wall thermometer at 11 in the morning when the outside temperature was 31 below. Nora Croft had been sitting at the table without a coat. The stove had been burning at what appeared to be a low setting. Morse listened to this report and then sat in his chair behind the trading post counter for a long time, doing nothing in particular. He wrote in his journal that evening, the one he kept in the locked drawer that no one else read, and what he wrote was not about the building. It was about the conversation in September, about what he had said and how he had said it, about the specific confidence with which he had turned his horse and ridden away. He wrote until he had said what needed to be said, then closed the journal without rereading it. What he wrote in the margin in smaller letters than the rest: if he is right about the walls, what else is he right about that I have already dismissed? Thomas had been making a different kind of discovery through early December 1 that had nothing to do with construction and everything to do with watching his parents exist together in a 16-foot square room through cold that had no interest in either of them. What he observed was not romantic in any way that he would have recognized as such from a distance, which was the distance he had been keeping for 4 years. It was functional in the deepest sense of the word, two people who had fitted themselves to each other over 26 years, with the same attention his father brought to notching a corner and his mother brought to sealing a wall, until the connection was as load-bearing as anything in the structure or around them. His mother tracked the temperature in the gaps each morning, not because anyone asked her to, but because it was the kind of information that mattered. And she was the kind of person who believed that information that matters should be recorded by someone. She had been doing this since the 2nd of November. 39 consecutive days of readings at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening outside temperature, and each gap layer an inner cabin. The data had a consistency to it that was almost stubborn, the system performing within a narrow band, regardless of what the outside temperature did, the differential holding between 60 and 65 degrees across the full assembly, even as the exterior dropped from single digits to the 20s and 30s below. One evening in mid-December, when the outside thermometer read 35 below and the inner cabin held 52, Thomas asked his mother how long she had been recording temperatures. She told him since the first fire. He asked whether she had recorded temperatures in her father's double-wall granary in Montana when she was a girl. A pause, and then her father had kept records from the first winter, and she had continued them after he died, and she still had the notebook somewhere in the trunk at the foot of the bed. She had always believed that a structure worth building was worth measuring, and that measurement without record was just curiosity, and curiosity without record died when the person who was curious died. Thomas thought about Jonas Croft's notebook, which was his father's most important possession, and about his own notebook, now 60 pages filled, and about the chain of record that ran from his great-grandfather, through his grandfather, through his father, through himself, each generation measuring the same principle in different materials and different conditions, each record incomplete on its own, and collectively something closer to proof than any single observation could constitute. He had been trained to believe that scientific knowledge was institutional, produced by formal methods in formal settings and validated by formal review. What he was sitting inside in a cabin that held 52 degrees against 35 below, on the strength of design principles that had been worked out and refined over 3 generations of American frontier construction, was a different kind of knowledge. Not lesser. Different. The kind that could not be fully translated into his Portland textbooks because it had been tested in conditions that the Portland textbooks had not been written to address. He began a new section in his notebook that evening, separate from the temperature logs and the R-value calculations, in which he wrote down everything he knew about Jonas Croft's 1831 shelter, everything his father had told him about his grandfather Robert's refinements, and everything he had observed in the construction of the current structure. He was not sure what the document was for yet. He was building it the way his father built things because the need for it would become apparent in time, and it was better to have it ready. Roy Greer had been watching the calendar with the attention of a man who has placed a bet and is waiting for the outcome. By mid-December, he had heard enough about the temperature readings from the Croft structure passed through the web of Trading Post gossip that was the territory's primary information system to know that his initial prediction about the green timber and the cracked seals had not materialized. He shifted his position, as flexible thinkers do, to a new argument. The cold had not been serious yet. The real test was January. The nested system might perform adequately in December conditions, which any well-built single-wall structure also handled, but the design had inherent vulnerabilities that would only manifest under sustained extreme cold. The vulnerabilities he described were real in the way that all objections to things that work contain a real component alongside the motivated one. 3 independent structural systems created more joints, more connections between materials, with different thermal expansion coefficients, more opportunities for differential movement to open pathways that the original construction had sealed. A single wall structure moved as one piece. 3 nested structures moved as 3 pieces, and the interfaces between them were where the failure would come. He said this at the Trading Post on the 17th of December with an audience of 6 men, 2 of whom were staying at the post for the winter and 4 of whom were passing through. Thomas was one of the 4 passing through. He had ridden south to pick up a supply order his father had placed in October, and he was sitting at the back of the Trading Post's main room with a cup of coffee when Greer Greer made his argument, and for a moment he had the experience of hearing something technically reasonable applied in a context designed to make a person look foolish who did not deserve to look foolish. He stood up. He did not raise his voice, and he did not preface what he said with any announcement of who he was or where he had been educated, because in his father's world, those things were considered a form of borrowing credibility rather than earning it. He said that he had spent 6 weeks measuring every dimension of the Croft construction and calculating its thermal performance using the same methods that were taught at the Portland School of Engineering, and that the differential thermal expansion across the three shells had been accounted for in the design through independent foundation sills and independent roof systems that allowed each shell to move without stressing the others, and that the ceiling at each shell had been tested and documented and showed no failures through 6 weeks of temperatures ranging to 35 below. Greer looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. "You're Croft's boy." Thomas met his eyes. "I'm the person who measured it." There was a silence in the room that had a different quality from ordinary silence. Greer left shortly after, and two of the men who had been listening found reasons to ask Thomas questions about the construction that were genuine questions rather than challenges, the kind of questions people ask when they have been carrying a skepticism that has started to feel like a liability and want to put it down if they can do so without embarrassing themselves. Morse was behind the counter for all of this and said nothing. But when Thomas was leaving, Morse stopped him with a question that had nothing to do with the performance data and everything to do with something he had been working toward since he had sent his hired man north 2 weeks earlier. He asked whether 53 degrees in the inner cabin was the temperature the structure was designed to hold, or whether it was simply what had been achieved so far at December temperatures. Thomas told him the design was based on achieving approximately 54 degrees at the interior, under the coldest anticipated conditions, which the family's collective knowledge of the territory suggested meant 65 to 70 below at the extreme. The performance at 35 below was not the system at its limit. It was the system under moderate load. Morse looked at him for a moment, and at 65 below, Thomas's answer was not a promise. It was a calculation delivered with the appropriate uncertainty of a man who understands the difference between a prediction and a result. The mathematics say the interior should hold between 50 and 55 degrees. My father believes the mathematics. What Thomas did not say, but what was present in the conversation anyway was, and so do I, he had arrived in October with a leather case full of ways to question his father's work. He was leaving the trading post in December with 60 pages of documentation that confirmed it. The distance between those two positions was not a measurement he had taken. It was one he had lived. Calvin Marsh came into the trading post the same afternoon, arriving from his trap line with a week's worth of pelts and the brittle cheerfulness of a young man who has not yet been cold enough to stop being cheerful about it. He bought a small quantity of supplies and mentioned that his stove was running harder than expected and that he was thinking about adding more insulation around the door frame, which had been showing some frost on cold mornings. Thomas, who had heard this description, recognized it. The frost at the door frame was not a door frame problem. It was a wall problem, the wood moving as it dried, the chinking failing at the edges of the log faces, where the interface between the two materials was thinnest and most vulnerable to differential movement. The door frame was where he was seeing it first because the door frame was a thermal weak point, but the same process was happening throughout the wall system. He knew this the way he now knew other things about construction, not from a textbook, but from 6 weeks of watching his mother run a candle flame along sealed surfaces and understanding what it meant when the flame bent. He almost said something. He had the words assembled, the specific technical observation about green timber movement and chinking failure, and what it meant for a single wall structure's ability to hold temperature when the real cold arrived. He looked at Calvin Marsh's 29-year-old face, open and undamaged and confident in the way that faces are before experience has had its say, and he thought about saying it. Calvin bought his supplies and left before Thomas could decide. The territory crossed into January with temperatures that stayed below 20 for the first 8 days, which was cold without being extraordinary. And then the barometer began to move on the evening of the 9th in the way that experienced men in that country had learned to read the way sailors read the horizon, not with alarm, but with the specific quality of attention that is indistinguishable from alarm and its effects. Pete Harlan stopped at the Croft homestead on his way back from his eastern trapline late in the afternoon of the 9th and looked at the sky and then at the barometer that Elias kept mounted on the outer shell's interior wall, and his voice when he spoke had lost the measured quality he usually carried. He had trapped the Yukon drainage for 12 years. He had seen the cold come early and late and from directions that confounded predictions. What the barometer was showing, combined with the specific quality of the air, the way sound carried differently when a certain kind of system was building to the north, the slight crystalline character that the moisture in his breath had taken on in the last hour, that was different from the ordinary ice breath of a winter afternoon, was not a reading he had seen more than twice in 12 years. Both times it had preceded temperatures that had tested every structure in the territory beyond what its builders had anticipated. Elias looked at the barometer and then at the sky through the outer shell's small window, where the last light was doing something particular to the clouds that he had seen described in his father's notes and had never expected to see himself. A specific banding at the horizon that meant the air mass coming down from the north was not the ordinary cold, but the other kind. The kind that had a different relationship to the word extreme. He checked the wood supply against the stove's consumption rate. He checked the vent baffles in both gaps. He walked through the inner cabin and pressed his hands against the wall surfaces at each corner and along each horizontal log face, and found what Nora's candle test had found 6 weeks earlier: nothing. No movement, no breach. The ceiling was holding everywhere he tested. Outside, the temperature at 6 in the evening was 53 below. By 8, it had dropped to 58 below and was still moving. Deep in the spruce stand to the east, the cold reached into the heartwood of the largest trees, and the sound they made was not a creak or a pop, but something between a groan and a concussion. The sound of living wood surrendering to pressure that had finally exceeded what its cellular structure could hold. In his cabin 12 miles east, Calvin Marsh fed his stove for the third time that evening and did not notice the thin line of cold air that entered along the base of the northwest wall, where the chinking had finally opened along a crack 4 inches long and the width of a matchstick, a gap that in ordinary cold was a draft, and in what was coming was something else entirely. At the trading post, Arthur Morse had both stoves running full and was looking at his wood supply with an arithmetic that kept arriving at an answer he did not want. The frost on the interior walls had moved again. It was no longer in the lower sections. It was at shoulder height on the north wall, which meant the cold was penetrating to the core of his 12-inch logs faster than his fire could drive it back. In the innermost cabin of the nested structure, the thermometer read 52 degrees at 8 in the evening with a moderate fire. Outside, 58 below. 110 degrees of difference held by 3 log walls and 2 layers of still air, and the accumulated knowledge of 3 generations of American builders who had understood each in their own way and in their own language that the cold was not defeated by mass. It was defeated by silence. The silence was holding. For now, the silence was holding, and the fire was modest, and the wood supply was not a problem, and somewhere to the north, the Arctic system that would define the winter of 1889 was descending on the Yukon drainage with a completeness and a severity that would settle in the following weeks every question that had been left open since September. The 14th of January arrived without the courtesy of announcement. It did not announce itself as a record or a threshold or a test of anything human beings had built. It arrived the way catastrophic cold always arrives in the deep interior of Alaska, as a continuation of the night before, which had itself been a continuation of the night before that, each increment of temperature loss so consistent and so patient that the mind that was tracking it had time to understand what was happening, but not enough leverage to do anything except prepare and wait and hope that preparation had been sufficient. By 4 in the morning, the thermometer outside the Croft homestead read 67 below zero. Elias had been awake since 2. Not from worry exactly, though worry was present in the way that awareness of danger is always present in men who have been taught to take cold seriously. He was awake because 60 years of instinct had built in him a sensitivity to the quality of silence, that a specific category of cold produced a silence that was not the ordinary silence of a winter night, but something more absolute. The silence of air that had lost the last of its movement and was simply present, dense and fatal and waiting. He had heard the forest working through the early hours, deep hollow detonations carrying through the triple walls as the cold reached into the oldest trees and settled its claim in a way that admitted no negotiation. He dressed in the lamplight and checked the stove, added 2 pieces of spruce to the coals, and stood for a moment in the middle of the inner cabin. The thermometer on the wall read 54 degrees. He looked at it for a long time, not because he doubted it, but because the number required a moment to hold alongside its context. Outside 67 below, inside 54 above. 121 degrees of separation maintained by 3 log walls and 2 volumes of air that had nowhere to go and therefore went nowhere. He took the small lamp and opened the inner door into the second gap where the thermometer he had mounted on a nail in the middle shell's interior surface read 22 above. He stood in the gap for a moment, feeling the cold that was present, but not the cold that was outside the cold that had been moderated by the outer gap and the outer shell before it reached this space, the cold of a difficult February afternoon, rather than the cold of an Antarctic record. Through the middle door into the first gap, where the lamp threw light on the outer shell's interior surface, which was frosted in a way that the inner shells were not the frost, a white record of everything the outer wall had absorbed through the night so that the walls behind it would not have to. The thermometer in the first gap read 5 below. The outer shell was sacrificing itself. That was what it was built to do. It faced 67 below on its exterior and returned 5 below on its interior, and the still air held in that gap carried the burden of that differential, without moving, without conducting, without betraying the shells behind it to the killing cold outside. Elias pressed his palm against the outer shell's interior log face and felt the deep cold in the wood cold that went all the way through to the exterior surface where the frost was building. He held his hand there for a moment, not with sentiment, but with the recognition of a craftsman who understands what each component of a system is contributing and what it is costing that component to contribute it. He went back inside where Thomas was awake and sitting up in his blankets on the floor pallet he had been using since November, looking at his father with an expression that asked the question without requiring the words. Elias told him the readings. Outside 67 first gap, 5 below, second gap, 22 above inner cabin 54. Thomas wrote them in his notebook, which was within arm's reach of where he slept, because it had become that kind of notebook, the kind that a person keeps close, not from habit, but from the understanding that what is being recorded matters and records themselves are fragile. Nora had heard the numbers from her place in the bed. She did not get up immediately. She lay still for a moment, and what she was doing in that stillness was not fear management. It was the specific mental process of a woman who keeps records, running the numbers against the pattern she had been accumulating since November, checking the current reading against the trend, confirming that the system was performing inside the range the trend predicted. It was. She got up and put water on the stove for coffee and did not say anything for a while, and the silence she kept was not tense. It was the silence of a person who has done the calculation and found that the answer is acceptable. The modest fire in the small iron stove was burning 6 pieces of spruce as it had burned 6 pieces of spruce at each of its 4 daily feedings since November. Not 4 stoves, not 2 stoves. 1 stove, 1 feeding 6 pieces, and the inner cabin held 54 degrees against 67 below. Elias did not remark on this. The absence of remark was its own kind of statement, the statement of a man for whom the confirmation of a design principle, 3 generations in the making, carried a satisfaction too fundamental for words. 40 miles south, Arthur Morse's trading post had stopped pretending. Both stoves were burning at maximum capacity, consuming wood at a rate that had moved from concerning to alarming sometime in the first week of January, and the interior temperature on the morning of the 14th registered at 16 degrees, which was survivable, in the way that falling from a second-story window is survivable, technically true, accompanied by significant damage. The frost on the north wall had reached the ceiling. 3 of his hired men had pulled their sleeping pallets to within 4 feet of the larger stove and were sleeping in rotation to keep feeding it through the night, because if the fire dropped while they slept, the temperature would fall to something that would not be survivable in the time it would take to rebuild the heat. Morse was burning furniture. The 2 storage benches along the east wall had gone in on the 12th. A work table followed on the 13th. He was looking at the remaining wooden fixtures with the eyes of a man doing triage sorting between what could be sacrificed and what could not, knowing that the category of what could not be sacrificed was shrinking with each calculation. His wood supply, which had been generous by any previous winter's measure, was being consumed at 20 times the rate the winter of 1887 had required. He had known this ratio since Whitmore's report had found its way back to him in December. He had known it in the abstract, the way you know a statistic before it applies to you directly. He knew it now concretely in the way that concrete knowledge differs from abstract knowledge by being inescapable rather than merely accurate. 2 miles from Morse's post in the cabin that Calvin Marsh had built from green spruce in September with the single-wall construction of a man who had not known yet what the territory would eventually ask of him, there was no smoke from the stovepipe. There had been no smoke since the morning of the 12th, which was what Pete Harlan noticed when he came through on the 14th on his way from his trap line, traveling in cold that made every movement a calculation and every stop a decision about whether the decision to stop was more dangerous than the decision to continue. The 5 days between the barometer drop on the 9th and this morning had been a progressive ratcheting of conditions that exceeded what any single-wall structure in the drainage had been built to handle. The cold had not arrived in one dramatic drop, but in the manner of a siege each night, delivering another 5 degrees each morning, offering no recovery, the territory's ordinary cold simply replaced by something categorically different that wore the same name but bore no resemblance to what people had survived before. The structures that failed in this period, not all at once, but in the incremental way that margins disappear. 1 degree of interior warmth at a time, 1 piece of furniture at a time, 1 cord of wood at a time. Pete had been managing at his double-wall cabin with a stubbornness that was part practical and part pride. The pride of a man who had built something he believed in and was not prepared to abandon it until the evidence was unambiguous. The evidence had become unambiguous in the first week of January. His single air gap, which had performed well through the 20s and 30s below, had reached the limits of what 1 layer of still air could accomplish against temperatures that dropped below 50. His interior had fallen to 28 degrees on the 10th despite a full stove, and to 23 on the 13th, and he had spent the last 2 nights in his heaviest fur, with the fire burning through the night and his wood supply dropping at a rate that removed all the arithmetic he had done in September about whether he had enough. He had enough for another 6 days if the cold held at current levels. He saw the Marsh cabin as he came around the river bend, and the absence of smoke registered before anything else did, before the visual details of the structure resolved in the gray morning light, because smoke from a stovepipe in this cold was not comfort or convenience. It was the difference between a cabin with a living person in it and a cabin with the other kind. He pulled his dogs to a halt and sat for a moment, and what he was doing in that moment was the thing that experienced men in lethal cold do before they confirm what they already know. He was preparing himself to find it. Calvin Marsh was sitting against the wall beside the coal stove in the posture of a man who had sat down to wait for something and had kept waiting past the point where waiting was an option. His wood supply, which had been stacked along the south wall, was reduced to 3 pieces. He had not run out of wood entirely. He had run out of the capacity to continue managing it, which was a different failure and a more complicated one. The failure of a young body overwhelmed by the relentless thermal drain of a structure that had been hemorrhaging heat since the chinking failed in early January, a structure that had been asking more of its fire than its fire could provide and more of its occupant than any single person could sustain alone. He was 29 years old. He had come from Oregon with the intention of building something in a new place which was the oldest American story, and had arrived without the knowledge that the oldest American stories in the northern interior were also the most dangerous ones for the people who didn't understand what the territory required of them before it gave them anything. Pete sat with him for a few minutes in the cold cabin before he left to continue toward Morse's post. What he carried when he left was not grief exactly, though grief was present. It was something more structural, the understanding that the difference between a man who survived a Yukon winter and a man who didn't was not courage or youth or physical strength. It was the specific knowledge that cold was not a climate condition to be endured, but a system to be understood, and that the cost of not understanding it was not hardship, but finality. Morse received the news with the stillness of a man who has been moving toward this information without wanting to arrive at it. He sat behind his counter after Pete had told him and did not speak for a full minute. And what was happening in that silence was not the processing of surprise, because Morse was not surprised. He was confronting the specific weight of a choice made in September when he had looked at Calvin Marsh's green timber single-wall cabin from horseback and had turned south without speaking. One word about the timber, one sentence about what happened to Greenwood when it dried in extreme cold. He did not know whether Calvin would have listened. He knew he had not tried. The acknowledgement of that fact did not produce anything dramatic in him. It did not produce tears or self-recrimination or the kind of expressive guilt that resolves into absolution. It produced a settled, cold, permanent addition to the inventory of things he knew about himself, filed alongside everything else he had learned in 15 years in the Yukon about the difference between what he was capable of and what he had actually done. He told Pete that morning what he had been telling himself since the 8th of January, when the temperature had first broken 50 below, and the trading post's interior had dropped below 30, for the first time in its 14-year history. He was going to ride to the Croft homestead. He was going to make the journey in 62 below zero, because the alternative was to continue sitting in a building that was failing at its primary purpose, while consuming wood at a rate that would leave him without fuel before February, and because he needed to know what he had been refusing to know since September needed to know it in the way that a man's body needs water, not from curiosity, but from necessity. Pete looked at him across the counter in the 16-degree trading post. He did not try to discourage him. He asked instead whether Morse intended to go alone, and when Morse said yes, Pete said that he was going too because his wood supply had 6 days left, and his cabin had 23 degrees inside, and he had already done the calculation about how that ended. He said this without self-pity and without the particular quality of defeat that men in cold climates sometimes carry when their structures have failed them. He said it the way a craftsman acknowledges a design limitation clearly, accurately, and without attachment to the version of events where it had gone differently. The journey took 5 hours and 20 minutes through air that was trying to kill both of them with the impersonal efficiency of a natural system operating at the outer boundary of its range. Morse drove the dog team and Pete rode alongside on his horse, and neither of them talked because talking required exposing the moisture in breath to air that converted it to ice crystals in the time between the mouth and the world. And ice crystals in the airways were a prelude to problems that could not be managed 40 miles from shelter. They stopped once for 8 minutes when one of the lead dogs showed signs of the specific behavioral shutdown that preceded hypothermic collapse in working dogs, and Morse spent those 8 minutes rubbing circulation back into the dog's extremities with hands that were losing feeling through 3 layers of gloves, while Pete kept the other dogs moving to prevent them from seizing up. The Croft homestead appeared through the spruce at the end of the 5th hour as a shape that did not fit the natural geometry of the forest. 3 roof lines at 3 different heights. The outermost walls frosted white on every surface facing north and west, a thin thread of smoke from the central pipe that was the first thing Morse registered, because it was the thing his eyes were looking for, the evidence of ongoing combustion of a fire that was feeding rather than failing. Elias was outside when they arrived, which was itself a form of information. A man whose shelter was working adequately could be outside at 67 below for short periods if he was dressed correctly, because he was going back inside to warmth rather than managing a crisis. He was checking the baffle vents on the outer gap, a routine inspection he had been making twice daily since the temperature dropped below 50, confirming that the small openings were not obstructed by the frost that was building on every exposed surface. He looked at Morse and Pete without surprise, which meant he had been expecting them in the way that a man expects the confirmation of something he already knows, not with certainty, but with the calm of probability. He told them to come in, and he told them to let each door close behind them before opening the next. And the protocol was not hospitality, but engineering. The recognition that 3 doors standing open simultaneously would create a thermal pathway from the inner cabin to the exterior that would take an hour of fire to recover from. The first door opened into the outer gap, where the cold was absolute but static. Cold of a room that has been sealed from wind and circulation, and both men stood for a moment adjusting to the specific quality of it. Cold that had depth but no movement. Cold that pressed without cutting. Morse pulled the outer door shut behind them. Elias opened the middle door, and they moved into the second gap, and the change was immediate and anatomical warmth. That was not warmth by any civilized standard, but that registered in the body as warmth, because the body's temperature sensing is comparative rather than absolute, measuring change rather than condition. Pete made a sound that was not a word. The middle door closed. The inner door opened. What Morse felt when he crossed into the inner cabin was not the relief of a man who has been cold and finds heat. It was a more disorienting experience than that, the experience of encountering something that should not be possible given everything he understood about how shelter and cold interacted. The warmth was not coming from a stove pushing heat into a space that was trying to lose it as fast as the stove could provide it. The warmth was simply present held, contained the ambient condition of a space that was not fighting the cold outside, but had simply declined to participate in it. He stood in the middle of the inner cabin and felt the temperature touching him from all sides equally, no cold wall drawing heat from his right shoulder, while the stove heated his left side just an even 54 degrees, surrounding him like something that had always been there. Nora was at the table. Thomas was by the window with his notebook. The stove was burning at a setting that would have been a courtesy fire in Morse's trading post, barely more than maintenance, a fire that was not fighting anything, but merely replacing the small losses that the five-boundary system allowed to escape. Morse looked at the thermometer on the wall. 54 degrees, outside 67 below, a fact that was somehow both present and theoretical from where he was standing, the way the depth of the ocean is both present and theoretical when you are standing on a dock. It was real. It was verifiable. It was separated from him by a distance that was not measured in feet. He asked Elias how much wood the stove had consumed in the last 24 hours. Elias told him 3 feedings of 6 pieces each, 18 pieces, roughly a quarter of a face cord over 2 weeks. Morse stood with that number for a moment, holding it against the inventory of furniture ash and storage bench remains that his trading post had been producing since the 13th. He had been burning a cord every 3 days. Elias was burning a quarter cord every 2 weeks. The ratio was not a surprise to him. Whitmore had told him the ratio in December when it had been an abstraction. Standing inside 54 degrees at 67 below, it was not an abstraction anymore. Elias took them back through the gaps, stopping in each to let Morse read the thermometers, and what Morse was experiencing as he moved through the layers was the experience that James Whitmore had tried to convey with thermal resistance calculations in November. The experience that no calculation had fully transmitted, because the calculation was a description of a system, and this was the system itself, 3 walls and 2 silences, extracting their toll from escaping warmth, the cold surrendering its claim in stages until it arrived at the living space with nothing left to take. Morse stood in the first gap at 5 below the outer shell, frosted and silent but behind him, and placed his bare hand flat against the middle shell's exterior surface. The wood registered against his palm as something that existed at the edge of cool and neutral, the temperature of a stone and shade on an autumn afternoon, not the bone-reaching cold of the outer wall, not the warmth of the living space, but a held middle condition that spoke entirely of what lay behind it rather than what surrounded it. He kept his hand there reading what the wood was telling him, the way a man reads a letter that arrives later than expected, but says exactly what he had hoped it would say. Then I told you that you were building walls around walls around walls. I said the cold would walk straight through. He pulled his hand back from the surface. The cold walked through my walls. It stopped here. Elias said nothing for a moment. The gap held them in its cold stillness, the 2 men standing in the dark space between the first and second shells of a structure that had just demonstrated at 67 below zero everything it had been built to demonstrate. Then you came through 62 below to get here. I'm not going to tell you you were wrong to need the proof. What happened in the trading post that evening and in the days that followed was the transmission that Morse had withheld in September. He told every man who came through the door what he had seen and what he had measured, and what the wood consumption differential was between the nested structure and his own post over the same period at the same temperatures. He was not evangelical about it. He was a man reporting findings, which was the specific register of honesty that happens when pride has been replaced by something more important. Most of them didn't believe him at first. A trapper named Garrett, who had been feeding his stove around the clock for 5 days and had burned through his storage wood and was working on the wooden sledge frame he had decided was less essential than staying warm, laughed with cracked lips and said that the cold had gotten to Morse's head. Morse told him the numbers again, the same numbers in the same order, and the laughter died somewhere in the middle of the second telling, because there is a point at which the specificity of a number removes the option of comfortable dismissal. Pete Harlan was at the trading post through the end of January, his wood supply having reached the terminal calculation he had predicted when he left his cabin on the 14th. He did not frame his situation as failure. He framed it as the difference between one gap and two, between a design that was adequate and a design that was sufficient, between the version of still air construction he had known about and the version Elias Croft had built in September. He answered questions from the men at the trading post about double wall construction with the authority of someone who had built it, lived in it, and watched it fail. And he was more useful to those conversations than someone who had only read about the principle, because he could describe not just what worked, but exactly where the boundary was between working and not. Roy Greer appeared at the trading post on the 21st of January, and the man who arrived was visibly different from the one who had been holding court there through the fall. His own supply post had dropped below 10 degrees on the 16th and had not recovered. He had burned through everything combustible that was not structural by the 19th, and on the 20th, he had made the decision that men in failing structures eventually make, which is to go somewhere that is not failing. He came into Morse's trading post and bought 3 nights' lodging without speaking about the Croft construction or nested shells or any of the arguments he had been making since October. He left on the 24th heading south toward Juneau and did not return to the Yukon drainage the following season or the season after that. The supply post 12 miles upriver changed hands in the spring of 1890 to a man who had heard about the winter of 1889 before he arrived and had already decided how he was going to build. James Whitmore arrived at the Croft homestead on the 22nd of January with an official survey commission and the specific institutional energy of a government functionary who has been given permission to do something he had already decided was the right thing to do. He spent 3 days conducting the most thorough documentation of the structure that had yet been attempted, taking readings every 2 hours through 2 full days and nights, recording the outer shell temperature at multiple points, the gap temperatures at base, middle, and peak of each space, the inner cabin temperature, and the outside ambient temperature with a calibrated instrument rather than the standard post thermometer that was subject to error at extreme readings. The resulting data set was, by the standards of territorial survey documentation, extraordinary. 48 hours of readings across a temperature range that went from 55 below to 64 below on the coldest night, with the inner cabin varying by only 4 degrees across the entire period between 50 and 54, regardless of what the exterior was doing. The 2-foot gaps performing at R20 each under confirmed zero convection conditions. The total system resistance verified at R52 at the lowest measurement and R57 at the highest. Thomas sat with Whitmore through both nights of measurement, not because Whitmore needed assistance, but because it was Thomas's data too, the culmination of the temperature log he had been keeping since November, and the moment when a personal record becomes official documentation is a moment worth witnessing. He answered Whitmore's technical questions with precision and without the tentativeness he had brought to his first conversations in the territory, the tentativeness of a man speaking a language he has learned in a classroom. He was speaking it now from inside the experience, and the difference was audible in every sentence. Whitmore told him at the end of the second night that he intended to submit the data set to the Territorial Engineering Board with a recommendation that the nested shell method be formally documented as a viable construction standard for extreme cold climates. He said this with the careful neutrality of a man who is making a professional statement rather than a personal one, but the personal element was present in it anyway, the specific satisfaction of an honest person who set out to disprove something and discovered instead that it was worth proving. The design will be attributed to Elias Croft, he said and paused. I'll note the generational origin. Jonas Croft, 1831. That's the correct record. Thomas looked at the page where Whitmore had written this. Then carefully he opened his own notebook to the section he had written in December, the one that traced the design history from Jonas, through Robert, through Elias, with the technical annotations he had added alongside. He set it on the table next to Whitmore's documentation. This is the full record. If you're building the official version, it should have the complete version alongside it. Whitmore looked at the notebook for a moment, at the combination of frontier observation and Portland engineering that occupied its pages, at the handwriting of a man who had arrived in October with a leather case full of reasons to doubt and had spent 4 months building something else entirely. He copied 3 pages into his official record verbatim. Then he handed the notebook back. The cold broke in the first week of February with a slowness that was almost anticlimactic. The temperature lifting 5 degrees one morning and 3 the next, the spruce trees going quiet as the compression in their wood fibers released. By the 10th of February, the thermometer outside the trading post read 12 below, which felt like a gift, which was the specific perceptual distortion that extreme cold produced temperatures that would have been alarming in October felt like relief in February because the reference point had shifted. Arthur Morse came north again in the second week of February after the temperature had lifted enough to make the journey something a man undertook by choice rather than desperation. He came with Roy Greer's name on his tongue and an honest accounting of what had happened in the months since September, including his own part in it. He told Elias about the furniture he had burned, about the 3 hired men who had suffered frostbite on the night of the 14th when the post's interior dropped to 11 degrees before dawn, about Calvin Marsh in the September afternoon. He had ridden past the green timber cabin without stopping. Elias listened to all of it. When Morse finished, the 2 men sat in the inner cabin for a moment, and the warmth that surrounded them had the particular quality of warmth that has earned its right to be there, warmth that exists because someone understood something deeply enough to build the conditions for it. Elias said, Calvin Marsh was 29 years old and he had been in the territory for 4 months. You and I have both been here long enough to know what 4 months in this country means and doesn't mean. He paused. I told him about the green timber. 1 sentence. That's what I had. Another pause. I've thought about whether 1 sentence was enough. I don't know what enough looks like exactly, except that it doesn't always prevent the outcome. Morse looked at the thermometer on the wall, 52 degrees. Outside, the temperature was 15 below. The differential had shrunk from the terrible arithmetic of the 14th, but the principle holding it had not changed. I told everyone at the post what I saw here, Morse said. I told them the numbers. I told them about the wood. He looked at Elias directly. I should have told them in September. I should have told you I was wrong in September. Elias said nothing for a moment. Then, you came through 62 below to find out. Some men would have sat in their trading post and decided they already knew. He stood moved to the stove, added 2 pieces of wood with the economy of a man who has never wasted a movement in his life. That's enough. It was enough. Both of them knew it was not everything, but they also knew the difference between enough and everything, and they knew that enough was what was available and was therefore the standard by which the situation should be judged. Thomas's reconciliation with his father was not a single moment. It was a process that had been underway since October and completed itself in small increments over February and into the spring, the way a structure settles into its foundation, not all at once, but in the gradual resolution of minor stresses across 1,000 points of contact. The formal marker of it happened on a Wednesday evening in February when Thomas set his completed notebook on the table in front of his father without preamble. Elias took it and read it carefully, beginning to end, spending the most time on the sections Thomas had written in December, the ones that traced the design history from Jonas through Robert, through himself with the thermodynamic annotations alongside. He read those pages twice. When he finished, he set the notebook down and looked at his son with an expression that was not pride in the showy sense, not the performance of fatherly approval, but the quieter thing, the recognition of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has discovered that he does not have to anymore. He said, Your grandfather kept a notebook. Your grandmother kept one for the granary in Montana. I kept this one. He pushed the Jonas notebook across the table to sit beside Thomas's. These belong together. One of them is observation without language for it. One of them is language without observation. Together, they're the whole thing. Thomas looked at the 2 notebooks side by side, the worn one with Robert's transcription of Jonas's words and his own with the Portland calculations in the November temperature logs in the December history section. He picked them both up and held them for a moment. Then he put them down one beside the other, and they left them there for the rest of the evening. By spring, Pete Harlan had begun rebuilding his cabin with 2 gaps instead of 1, working from a set of dimensions and specifications that Thomas had written for him over the course of a February afternoon at the trading post, using the language of engineering, where it was useful, and the language of craft, where it was more precise. Pete was a good enough builder to understand the difference between the two and to use each one correctly, and the specifications Thomas gave him were written accordingly, shifting registers where the situation required it. When Pete broke ground on the rebuild in April, he went back to Thomas with two questions about corner junction treatment that Thomas answered correctly the first time, which was the specific quality of competence that earns a man's trust in a craft community faster than any credential. James Whitmore's report reached the Territorial Engineering Board in March, and the formal documentation of the nested shell construction method entered the institutional record under the designation it would carry forward, the Croft method, with a notation attributing the originating design to Jonas Croft, pioneer settler, 1831, and the full-scale implementation and performance verification to Elias Croft, 1888. The report cited Thomas Croft's thermal resistance calculations and temperature documentation as the primary analytical record. It recommended the method for all new construction in the territory's extreme cold interior, specifically in locations where wood fuel supply was a limiting factor, which in the Yukon drainage meant essentially everywhere. 11 structures in the drainage had incorporated some version of nested shell construction by 1905. Not all of them were as precisely executed as the Croft homestead. Some used single gaps rather than two, finding that even one layer of still air produced a dramatic improvement over solid single-wall construction. Others used the full nested system, but with narrower gaps than the 2-foot optimal, trading some insulation value for a reduced footprint that their building sites required. All of them performed better than the solid construction that surrounded them, and all of their builders understood why, which was a different kind of knowledge from the kind that had existed before 1888. Elias Croft died in the spring of 1911 in the inner cabin he had built in September of 1888, in the warmth that his grandfather had understood and his father had refined, and he had built at scale, and his son had measured and documented. He died with the door open to the second gap because it was March and the temperature in the gap was above freezing for the first time since October, and the smell of cold air coming from outside through the gaps without the killing character of January cold was the smell of a season changing, which was the last thing he attended to before he stopped attending. Nora outlived him by 6 years. She refused to move into the new house Thomas had built a quarter-mile east, the one with 3 bedrooms and a proper kitchen and 2 fireplaces that heated it efficiently and adequately. She said that adequately was not the standard she had spent her life building toward, and she saw no reason to revise the standard at 72. She said this without drama and without sentiment and with the specific quality of conviction that had characterized everything she had built and recorded and insisted on for 50 years. After she died, Thomas found the note in the Bible in the drawer of the small table beside her bed, written in her careful hand on a piece of paper that had been folded and refolded enough times to suggest it had been written, revised, put away, retrieved, and written again over the course of several years. It was not long. She had never been a woman who said more than the necessary thing. She wrote they called Jonas crazy for building walls around walls. They called Elias crazy for the same reason. They said we wasted timber on empty space and that the cold would find us anyway. The cold did not find us. The empty space was not empty. It held stillness, and stillness held warmth, and 3 generations of this family learned that what you cannot see working is often the thing that is working hardest. They had forests to burn and still froze. We had knowledge and 2 silences, and our children were never cold. The notebooks are in the trunk. Keep them together. They need each other the way the walls need the gaps between them. Thomas kept the notebooks together. He placed Jonas's and his own in a single leather case with a clasp, and when he taught the nested shell method to the first group of engineering students, who formally encountered it in a classroom setting in 1903, he set both notebooks on the desk at the front of the room before the lecture began, and he told them one of these was written by a man who didn't know the math but understood the result, and one was written by a man who knew the math and had to learn the result. Neither one is sufficient without the other. He didn't say who had written which. He let them figure it out. The original structure stood until 1947, when Elias's grandson finally made the decision to take it down and build the modern frame house the family had been discussing for 15 years. The dismantling took 4 days, shell by shell, from outside in. The outer shell came down first, its logs still sound, after 59 years. The outer gap behind it dry and undisturbed, no condensation damage, no evidence of the moisture infiltration that had defeated other attempts in other cold climates during the same period. The middle shell followed its dual-sealed surfaces intact. The inner shell came down last and showed the least deterioration of all three because it had faced the most moderate conditions, because that was what it had been designed to face the last while receiving cold that had already surrendered everything it had on the way in. From each shell, Elias's grandson saved one piece of timber. 3 logs, one from each layer notched together at the corners in the style that Jonas had used in Montana, and Robert had taught Elias and Elias had taught Thomas, the style that locked without nails. He built them into a bench. The bench went onto the porch of the new house where it sat through the winters that followed with the particular solidity of something that has been structural and is now commemorative, which is a different kind of strength, but not a lesser one. The bench is still there in Fairbanks. It has been through winters that the old-timers measured against 1889 and found wanting. Adequate was the word Pete Harlan had used in November of 1888 when he looked at his double-wall cabin and understood the distance between what he had built and what Elias Croft had built. The word had never fully shed the meaning it acquired in the second gap of the nested shell at 22 above zero, when adequate became the name for the space between a design that survived and a design that held. 3 walls, 2 silences. The cold had never reached the last one.